By the numbers, none of these operations failed. The largest American ground assault of the Vietnam War leveled an entire region, 60 square miles bulldozed, burned, and blown up from below. An assault in the mountains near Laos took a hill the enemy had fortified for years, and a campaign in the Mekong Delta produced one of the highest body counts of the entire war. 3 operations, 3 official successes, and 3 of the most controversial actions the American military has ever undertaken. Because the region refilled within months, the hill was abandoned within weeks, and the Army's own investigators concluded that thousands of those dead had never been soldiers at all. The story of the first begins with a piece of terrain that had defied the Americans for years. Northwest of Saigon lay a stretch of jungle, abandoned plantation, and village roughly 60 square miles across, bounded by the Saigon River and several smaller waterways that the Americans called the Iron Triangle. It had been a communist stronghold since the war against the French, more than 2 decades earlier. Beneath it ran a tunnel network, some of it dating to the 1940s, housing command posts, hospitals, workshops, and storage deep enough to survive almost anything dropped on the surface. The triangle sat barely 20 miles from the South Vietnamese capital, which made it both a sanctuary and a launching point for operations against Saigon itself. American and South Vietnamese forces had entered it before. They had probed it, fought through it, and withdrawn. They had never stayed, and they had never solved it. The reason was structural, and it sat at the heart of everything the Americans found frustrating about the war. The enemy controlled the tempo of engagement to a degree the Americans never fully neutralized. Main force units could withdraw across the Cambodian border, refit, and return at a time of their choosing. They could break contact and vanish into terrain the Americans found nearly impossible to hold. Sweeping the Iron Triangle had always produced the same result. The Americans would clear it, declare it cleared, and leave, and the enemy would move back in behind them. By late 1966, the American command concluded that sweeping the area would never work, and that the only way to neutralize it was not to clear it, but to destroy it entirely. The plan that emerged was unusual in its ambition. The objective was not simply to kill enemy soldiers or seize supplies, though both were expected. It was to render the Iron Triangle permanently uninhabitable as a base, to remove its population, level its structures, strip its vegetation, and seal its tunnels, transforming a living region into a free fire zone where anyone who remained could be treated as the enemy. The idea was to deny the area to the Viet Cong, not for a season but for good, by removing everything that made it usable. Cedar Falls began on January 8, 1967, and it was the largest American ground operation of the war to that point. The 1st Infantry Division, the 25th Infantry Division, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, and supporting South Vietnamese units were committed, around 30,000 troops in all. It was conceived as a hammer and anvil, with blocking forces positioned to catch the enemy as other units drove him toward them. The anvil was the village of Ben Suc, a community of roughly 6,000 people on the Saigon River that had been under Viet Cong control for years, serving as a supply and recruitment center for the entire region. The operation opened with one of the more striking set pieces of the war. At dawn, 60 helicopters carrying a battalion of the 1st Infantry Division landed directly on and around Ben Suc, sealing the village within minutes before its inhabitants could disperse into the surrounding country. The speed was the point. A conventional approach by road would have given the population, and any Viet Cong among them, ample warning to slip away, which was exactly what had happened in every previous operation. By dropping an entire battalion onto the village at once, the Americans intended to trap everyone inside it. What followed at Ben Suc became the moral center of the controversy. The entire population was removed. Villagers were assembled, screened for Viet Cong affiliation, and then transported, along with their livestock and whatever possessions they could carry, to a resettlement camp some miles away. Once the people were gone, the village itself was systematically destroyed. Engineers demolished the houses, bulldozers flattened what remained. In the final phase, demolition teams placed explosives in a central crater and detonated them beneath the rubble, collapsing the tunnels underneath. The journalist Jonathan Schell, who witnessed the operation and later wrote a book about it, understood the intent plainly. Ben Suc was not to be cleared. It was to cease to exist. The forced relocation of civilians sat at the heart of why Cedar Falls drew lasting criticism. The strategic logic was coherent on its own terms. If the population could not be separated from the insurgency by persuasion, it would be separated by removal, denying the Viet Cong the human infrastructure of food, labor, intelligence, and recruits that sustained them. The execution exposed the limits of that logic. The resettlement camps were inadequate, poorly prepared, and unable to absorb the people sent to them. Families that had farmed the same land for generations were deposited on unfamiliar ground, with little support and little prospect of returning. A program meant to win the population's loyalty instead demonstrated, in the most concrete terms imaginable, the cost of being caught between the two sides. People who had not necessarily chosen the Viet Cong now had a vivid reason to resent the government that had uprooted them. While Ben Suc drew the attention, the larger operation pressed into the Iron Triangle itself. Mechanized and infantry units advanced through the area while the Air Force and artillery prepared the ground ahead of them. Rome plows, massive armored bulldozers fitted with specially designed blades, carved wide lanes through the jungle, stripping away the canopy that had concealed enemy movement for decades. The scale of the land clearing was deliberate and unprecedented. If the vegetation was the enemy's protection, the vegetation would be removed, mile after mile, until the cover that had made the triangle a stronghold was simply gone. It was during Cedar Falls that American forces confronted the full extent of the tunnel networks beneath the triangle. Soldiers trained for the task, the tunnel rats, descended into the darkness with pistols and flashlights to map the complexes, recover documents, and clear them before demolition. It was claustrophobic, dangerous work against booby traps and the occasional defender, and what it produced was substantial. The tunnels yielded one of the more productive intelligence hauls of the war, a large cache of enemy documents, maps, and operational papers that analysts would study for months, detailing Viet Cong organization across the entire Saigon region. By the standard of intelligence value alone, Cedar Falls was among the more rewarding American operations of the period. The material results, tallied against the metric of the day, looked respectable. American figures credited the operation with around 750 enemy killed. Roughly 280 Viet Cong were taken prisoner, and a comparable number defected or surrendered. Engineers destroyed thousands of structures and tunnel sections and seized substantial quantities of rice and weapons, enough rice by some accounts to feed a large enemy force for a considerable period. American casualties were relatively light, with 72 killed. The figures, though, do not tell the whole story, and the gap between the numbers and the outcome is precisely what made Cedar Falls instructive. Physically, the operation succeeded in nearly everything it set out to do. The Iron Triangle was depopulated, flattened, and declared a free-fire zone. And yet the enemy main force units the operation hoped to trap had largely melted away before the hammer fell, slipping across into War Zone C or into Cambodia, beyond the reach of American ground forces. The body count, impressive on paper, represented a fraction of the forces that actually used the area, and the bulk of the fighting strength the operation was meant to destroy survived intact, simply by declining to be there. Then came the part that turned a tactical success into a parable. Within a matter of months, the Viet Cong returned to the Iron Triangle. The tunnels that had been destroyed were redug or bypassed. The cleared land offered no permanent barrier to an enemy who measured presence in fighters rather than in buildings, and who had nowhere else to be. By the start of 1968, during the Tet Offensive, the Triangle was once again serving as a base for attacks on the capital, functioning exactly as it always had. The Americans had proven decisively that they could take the Iron Triangle. What they had not done, and could not do under the strategy they were following, was hold it. Holding it required a permanent garrison, a standing presence that competed with every other demand on American manpower, and the strategy of mobile, search and destroy operations was built on the opposite premise. The troops would not tie themselves to ground, but would move constantly to find and destroy the enemy elsewhere. This was the central contradiction of the American way of war in Vietnam, laid bare in a single operation. The whole approach rested on attrition, on finding and destroying the enemy in such numbers that he could no longer fight. with progress measured not by ground held, but by the body count of enemy dead. It was a theory that demanded a way to keep score, and the body count was that score. An operation could destroy everything visible and change nothing essential. The metric registered the destruction. It could not register the return. 2 years later, and roughly 400 miles to the north, a very different operation exposed a different facet of the same problem. Where Cedar Falls was about terrain and population, the next was about a single hill, and about what it meant to capture ground that no one intended to keep. The setting was the A Shau Valley, in the far northwest of South Vietnam, near the Laotian border, in the northernmost military region, First Corps. The A Shau was one of the most strategically significant pieces of ground in the country, and one of the most dangerous. It served as a major terminus of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the network of roads and paths through Laos by which the north funneled men and supplies into the south. Through the A Shau flowed the material that sustained enemy operations across the northern provinces, which made it a place the Americans could not ignore and could not easily hold. American forces had been pushed out of the valley earlier in the war, and the North Vietnamese had spent the intervening years turning it into a fortified logistics hub, complete with anti-aircraft positions, storage areas, roads, and well-prepared defensive terrain. Entering the A Shau meant entering ground the enemy had prepared at leisure. By the spring of 1969, the political ground beneath the war had shifted in ways that would make what happened there especially contentious. Richard Nixon had taken office that January with a mandate to wind the American commitment down, and the policy of transferring the burden of combat to South Vietnamese forces was beginning to take shape. The public appetite for American casualties was draining away fast, and the sense that the war was being fought to a conclusion was giving way to the sense that it was being fought to an exit. The new American commander had begun moving away from the large unit attrition battles that had defined the earlier years toward a more cautious, population-focused approach. And yet operations in the field still followed the older logic, the logic of finding the enemy and killing him wherever he could be brought to battle. Operation Apache Snow began on May 10, 1969, as part of a broader effort to disrupt the North Vietnamese base areas in the A Shau and forestall any threat to the coastal lowlands and the city of Hue, the old imperial capital that had been the scene of bitter fighting the year before. The operation involved elements of the 101st Airborne Division, by then designated an Airmobile Division, along with the 9th Marine Regiment and South Vietnamese forces. The plan was a reconnaissance in force, a sweep through the valley to locate and destroy enemy units and supplies, rather than to seize and hold any particular objective. One feature in the area of operations was a mountain the maps labeled Hill 937, after its height in meters, known to the local population as Dong Ap Bia. The soldiers who fought there would give it a name that stuck, and that name would travel a great deal further than the operation itself. The 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt, drew the assignment of taking the mountain. What neither Honeycutt nor his superiors fully appreciated at the outset was that Hill 937 was held in strength by a well-entrenched North Vietnamese regiment dug into bunkers and fighting positions on terrain that strongly favored the defense. The mountain was steep, covered in dense jungle and bamboo, and laced with prepared positions that airstrikes and artillery struggled to reach. The defenders had chosen to stand and fight, which was itself unusual, and they had chosen ground on which standing and fighting cost the attacker dearly. The assault would have to go up the slope into prepared fire, again and again. The operational environment compounded every difficulty. The terrain consisted of steep, jungled ridges rising sharply from the valley floor. Triple canopy growth concealed the enemy bunkers until attacking troops were nearly on top of them, which stripped American firepower of much of its advantage, since you cannot accurately bomb what you cannot see. Monsoon weather brought rain that turned the slopes to mud and grounded the helicopters on which airmobile operations depended for movement, resupply, and evacuation. And the defenders held interlocking positions that channeled each American assault into prepared kill zones, so that every push up the hill ran into fire from several directions at once. The battle for the mountain lasted 10 days. Honeycutt's battalion launched repeated assaults up the slope, and repeatedly the defenders threw them back down it. Airstrikes and artillery pounded the hill relentlessly, stripping the vegetation and churning the earth until the upper slopes were a moonscape, and still the bunkers held, because earth and timber overhead cover absorbed an enormous amount of punishment. American reinforcements were fed into the fight, eventually committing several battalions, both American and South Vietnamese, to the effort to take a single hill. The fighting was close and costly. On more than one occasion, American units suffered casualties from their own supporting fire amid the confusion of assaulting a defended height in poor visibility, including a serious incident in which helicopter gunships struck friendly troops. The repeated frontal attacks, the steady toll, and the apparent absence of any larger purpose for that specific piece of ground generated a bitterness among the troops that found expression in the name they gave it. They called it Hamburger Hill, after what the meat grinder of repeated assaults did to the men sent up it. On May 20th, after 10 days and a final coordinated assault by multiple battalions advancing up several approaches at once, the summit was taken. The North Vietnamese, in their usual pattern, had withdrawn much of their force across the nearby Laotian border once the position became untenable, declining to be destroyed in place. American casualties were severe for an action of its size, with around 70 killed and over 400 wounded. Enemy dead were counted at over 600, though as with most body counts the figure was an estimate, complicated by casualties carried off the field or buried in collapsed bunkers, and impossible to verify with any precision. Then came the decision that transformed a costly tactical victory into a national controversy. Having taken the mountain at the cost of dozens of American lives, the army abandoned it. Within weeks of the summit being secured, American forces withdrew from Hill 937 because the position had no lasting strategic value. The objective had never been the hill itself. It was the destruction of the enemy units on it, in keeping with the attrition logic that governed the whole operation. Once those units had been engaged and the area swept, there was no reason to garrison a remote mountain in a valley the Americans did not intend to occupy permanently, and so the hill was given up. To the troops who had bled for it, and to the American public that learned of it, this was incomprehensible. The notion that men had died taking ground that was then simply given back struck at the very coherence of the war. If the hill was worth dying for, why was it not worth keeping? If it was not worth keeping, why had men died for it? The attrition logic had an answer to both questions, but it was not an answer the public found tolerable. The controversy reached the United States Senate, where Senator Edward Kennedy denounced the assault as senseless and irresponsible, a description that captured a mood far beyond his own politics. The battle became a lightning rod, a symbol of a war in which tactical actions seemed disconnected from any strategic purpose the public could recognize, and the coverage of it sharpened a question that more and more Americans were asking, which was what, precisely, all of this was for. The political consequence was direct and lasting. In the aftermath, the order came down that costly assaults of this kind were to be avoided, and American commanders were directed to conduct operations in a manner that would minimize American casualties wherever possible. The era of large-scale attrition battles for high ground was effectively over. The pursuit of a decisive point at which the enemy could no longer replace his losses was abandoned, not because that point had been reached, but because the country was no longer willing to pay for the attempt to reach it. Here was the second face of the contradiction. Cedar Falls had shown that destroying everything could change nothing. Hamburger Hill showed that winning the battle could be politically indistinguishable from losing it. The metric said the operation had succeeded, 600 enemy dead against 70 of their own, the objective taken. The metric had no column for the only question the public actually cared about, which was whether the dead Americans had bought anything at all. The third operation produced no set piece to rival the destruction of Ben Suc or the assault up Hamburger Hill. It generated no single battle that lodged in the public mind at the time, no name that a senator would invoke on the floor of Congress that year. What it produced instead was a number, and the number was so extreme that it eventually forced the army to look directly at the logic of the body count and recoil from what it saw. The setting was the Mekong Delta, the southernmost military region, 4th Corps, in the far south of the country. The delta was unlike anywhere else American forces operated. Flat, wet, and densely populated, a vast expanse of rice paddies, canals, and villages, It was home to a large share of South Vietnam's people and produced much of its rice, which made control of it a matter of real consequence to both sides. The terrain offered none of the empty jungle of the Central Highlands, none of the remote mountains of the Ershao. Here the enemy and the population occupied the same ground, often indistinguishably. The Viet Cong in the Delta operated as guerrillas embedded among farming communities, drawing food and shelter and concealment from villages that might be sympathetic, coerced, or simply trapped. Separating fighter from civilian in such a setting was not a tactical difficulty to be solved with better intelligence. It was a fundamental impossibility built into the nature of the place. By 1968, the American command had concluded that the Delta required more attention than it had received. The province of Kinh Hoa in particular was regarded as one of the most thoroughly Viet Cong-controlled areas in the entire country, a long-time insurgent stronghold where the South Vietnamese government's writ barely reached, and where the Viet Cong administration operated more or less openly. The operation conceived to address this was Speedy Express, conducted by the 9th Infantry Division under the command of Major General Julian Ewell, an officer whose intense, almost single-minded focus on the body count as the measure of a unit's performance would become central to the controversy that followed. Speedy Express ran from December 1968 through May 1969, and its method reflected both the character of the terrain and the disposition of the commander. The 9th Infantry Division employed what it called constant pressure, a relentless around-the-clock tempo of operations designed to keep the enemy off balance and deny him any sanctuary in time or space. This relied heavily on air-mobile tactics, helicopter-borne assaults that could place troops anywhere in the Delta on short notice, and on the extensive use of supporting firepower to a degree the terrain made dangerous. Helicopter gunships, artillery, and airstrikes were used in great volume. A defining feature of the operation was its heavy reliance on night operations and on firepower delivered into areas designated as enemy-controlled, where the working assumption was that anyone present was hostile and could be engaged accordingly. The results, by the metric of the day, were staggering, and that is precisely the problem. Over the course of the operation, the 9th Infantry Division reported a body count exceeding 10,000 enemy killed. Against this enormous figure, the division recorded the capture of fewer than 750 weapons. American losses were comparatively very low, with around 250 killed. The ratio of enemy dead to weapons captured is the detail that should have prompted scrutiny, and eventually did. In conventional combat against armed enemy soldiers, the number of bodies and the number of weapons recovered should bear some rough relationship to each other, because soldiers carry weapons and the dead tend to leave them on the field. A body count of more than 10,000 set against fewer than 750 captured weapons implied one of two things. Either the enemy was abandoning the overwhelming majority of his weapons, which was inconsistent with everything known about Viet Cong logistics and discipline, since weapons were scarce and prized and rarely left behind, or a large proportion of those counted as enemy dead had never been armed at all. The kill ratio, more than 40 enemy dead for every American lost, sat so far outside the experience of the rest of the war that it raised unavoidably the question of who exactly was being counted. The reality behind the figures was that Speedy Express had been conducted in a densely populated region using levels of firepower poorly suited to distinguishing combatants from civilians. The heavy use of helicopter gunships and artillery against a landscape of villages and paddies, frequently at night and frequently in areas where anyone present was presumed hostile, produced a body count that swept in large numbers of non-combatants. The pressure within the division to produce high body counts, flowing down from a command structure that treated the metric as the definitive measure of success, created an environment in which the distinction between enemy fighters and dead civilians steadily eroded. When the goal is the number, and the number is what your career is judged on, the number is what you produce. This was not merely a post-war inference drawn by critics with the benefit of hindsight. Concerns were raised at the time, including within the chain of command, by people who looked at the figures and the methods and were troubled by what they implied. Those concerns prompted an internal investigation by the Army's Inspector General. That investigation concluded that a substantial number of civilian deaths had occurred during the operation. estimates of the civilian toll varied considerably. A confidential analysis suggested that the number of innocent civilians killed during Speedy Express may have run well into the thousands, with one widely cited estimate placing it at around 5,000. The investigation's findings were not made public at the time. They were classified, and the matter was effectively buried for years, surfacing publicly only later through journalism, most notably a 1972 article by the reporter Kevin Buckley in Newsweek that brought the operation's human cost to a wider audience for the first time. No charges followed. The investigation acknowledged that excessive force had likely caused large numbers of civilian deaths, but it produced no prosecution. And within the system that prized the very metric Ewell had so aggressively pursued, the operation was officially regarded as a significant military success on the strength of its body count. The general's reputation was enhanced rather than damaged by the operation's reported results. The man who ran it was rewarded by the institution whose incentives he had followed to their logical conclusion. Speedy Express revealed the third and most disturbing face of the contradiction. Cedar Falls showed the metric registering destruction that accomplished nothing. Hamburger Hill showed it registering a victory the public would not accept. Speedy Express showed it could be satisfied abundantly by killing the very population the war was supposedly being fought to protect. When the measure of success is bodies, and the bodies cannot be reliably told apart, the system will produce bodies. The incentive did the rest. Taken together, the three operations point to a single institutional failure, the elevation of a measurable proxy over the actual objective. The body count was adopted because the war offered no front lines, no captured capitals, none of the conventional markers of progress that armies had always used to measure how a war was going. In the absence of territory gained, the Americans counted the dead, and what gets measured gets managed. Once the body count became the currency of success, every level of the command had a reason to maximize it, and the incentive bent behavior in predictable directions. At Cedar Falls, it produced an operation that razed a region and counted the rubble as progress, while the enemy simply waited and returned. At Hamburger Hill, it produced a battle fought for the enemy on the ground rather than the ground itself, which made taking the hill and then leaving it entirely rational from inside the logic and incomprehensible from outside it. At Speedy Express, it produced its most extreme expression, a count so large and so detached from the evidence of actual combat that it could only be explained by the killing of non-combatants on a significant scale. There is a further pattern worth drawing out, one that concerns the relationship between firepower and the kind of war being fought. American forces in Vietnam possessed overwhelming material superiority, and each of these operations was in part an attempt to apply that superiority to a problem it was poorly suited to solve. The Rome plows and demolition charges of Cedar Falls, the airstrikes and artillery that stripped Hamburger Hill bare, the gunships and night fires of the Delta all represented the substitution of firepower for the more difficult work of securing populations and holding terrain. Firepower could destroy, it could not discriminate, and it could not hold. Against an enemy embedded in the population and the land, the application of maximum firepower frequently produced maximum destruction and minimal lasting effect. And in the worst case, as in the Delta, it produced atrocity. It would be too simple, though, to present these operations as uniform failures. Cedar Falls did yield genuine intelligence that informed American operations for months afterward, and the documents pulled from those tunnels had real value. Apache Snow did disrupt enemy logistics in the Ashau, at least temporarily, and the units engaged on Hill 937 fought with considerable skill and tenacity under conditions that would have broken less disciplined troops. Even Speedy Express did degrade Viet Cong strength in the Delta, and Kien Hoa province was, for a time, brought under greater government control than it had known in years. The criticism is not that these operations achieved nothing. It is that what they achieved was measured by a standard that systematically misrepresented their actual strategic value, and in the case of Speedy Express, concealed a moral catastrophe behind a favorable statistic. The South Vietnamese dimension deserves its own note, because it tends to vanish from accounts focused on American decisions, and because the survival of an independent South Vietnamese state was the entire point of the war. South Vietnamese forces participated in all three operations, and their presence reflected the underlying purpose that American firepower was supposedly serving. At Cedar Falls, the displaced civilians of the Iron Triangle were South Vietnamese citizens whose loyalty the war was supposedly contesting, and the resettlement program's failures undercut the political objective the military operation was meant to advance. In the Delta, the civilians killed during Speedy Express were the very people whose allegiance Saigon needed to win. Operations that counted them as enemy dead, or that failed to count them at all, were in a real sense waging war against the population that was the prize. This was the deepest contradiction of attrition in a counterinsurgency, and these three operations expressed it from three different angles, each more troubling than the last. What changed after these operations is instructive about which lessons the institution was capable of learning and which it was not. Hamburger Hill produced an immediate and concrete policy shift because its cost was American and its political visibility was high. The army stopped fighting that kind of battle, more or less on the spot. Speedy Express, whose cost was overwhelmingly Vietnamese and whose findings were classified, produced no comparable reckoning. The investigation happened, the conclusions were filed away, and the officer responsible was promoted. The difference in institutional response had little to do with the relative gravity of what occurred, since by any honest accounting the Delta was the graver matter, and a great deal to do with who paid the price and whether the public could see it. The American military emerged from Vietnam having absorbed some of these lessons and not others. The body count as a metric was largely discredited, and the post-Vietnam Army made a deliberate effort to move away from attrition as a measure of success toward objectives that could be more meaningfully assessed. The doctrinal emphasis shifted over the following decades in ways that reflected a real reckoning with what the numbers had done to judgment. The deeper difficulty, though, the problem of applying conventional military power to a war embedded in a population, was not so much solved as set aside, and it would resurface in later conflicts in forms the veterans of the Delta and the A Shau would have recognized at once. Three operations, then, controversial for reasons that only partly overlap. One razed a region that refilled behind it within months. One won a mountain and walked off it within weeks. One generated a body count its own investigators could not reconcile with the evidence of combat. The thread that ties them together is the number that was chosen to measure progress and instead came to define it, until the measurement and the reality it was supposed to track had parted company completely. The Iron Triangle was reoccupied, Hill 937 was abandoned, and the dead of the Mekong Delta were filed under a statistic that, for a long time, no one outside the chain of command was permitted to question.